Hi guys, welcome to our discussing regarding whether the government should increase government spending and tax credit in the COVID-19 context. As we all have known, the COVID-19 pandemic has struck the global economy hard since the beginning of 2020. As a result, since the start of the pandemic, nations across the world have implemented large-scale fiscal policy measures to mitigate the unprecedented production losses, boost the economy, and stimulating aggregate demand. This policy includes the government spending and tax credit, and we will examine the effect of this policy by bringing on societies and the economy as a whole. Now, I will go through today's agenda. First, we will explain different types of fiscal policy, then an overview of the economic during the pandemic. Next, we will come to the benefit and drawback of the policy, and lastly, our point of view and conclusion. To begin, this is the theoretical view of fiscal policy presented by Minhu.
Thanks for his introduction. Now I'm going to talk about the theoretical field of fiscal policy in general. The fiscal policy is the act of the government adjusting its spending and revenue to influence the economic conditions. There are two main types of fiscal policies: expansionary fiscal policy, which is the one we're going to discuss, and contractionary fiscal policies. In the above graph, the expansionary fiscal policy recommends the government should increase government spending and decrease tax revenue to boost economic growth. Therefore, they will increase disposable income and encourage more investment. This will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, increasing price level and equilibrium. Conversely, the contractionary fiscal policy in below graph decelerates economic activities by reducing expenditures and increasing tax revenues, which will decrease individuals' disposable income and consumption. This results in aggregate demand shift to the left, reducing price level and equilibrium. So, the implementation of fiscal policy creates a multiplier effect and cradle effect on the economic situations. The multiplier effect occurs when there is an adjustment in the final national income due to an initial withdrawal or injection of capital. When the government adjusts spending and revenue, they either create or reduce investment and consumption. Therefore, with each dollar spent, the government can raise or lower the aggregate demand by more than a dollar. The multiplier effect measures the impact of the change in government economic activities on the total economic output. The cradle effect is the result of the expansionary fiscal policy, leading to a surge of interest rate and reducing investment. The interest rate rise as the increase in spending raise the money demand in the money market. Therefore, the demand for business investment goods declines as borrowing becomes more expensive. Now, this is an overview about the economy in the pandemic presented by Wunan.
Thank you, Ho. To understand why the government needs to do something to have the economy recover from the pandemic, let's look at the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. According to Statista, global GDP amounted about $84.7 trillion in 2020, almost $3 trillion lower than in 2019 due to COVID. Travel restrictions imposed on Chinese residents as a result of crisis have inflicted a huge blow to tourism spots throughout Asia. Hanoi Times also stated that COVID-19 harmed 87.2% of enterprises in Vietnam, and almost 90% of business in Vietnam were affected. In our study, we provided additional evidence of the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. Please review our paper for more information. In such difficult scenario, our group found out that fiscal policy can help stimulate aggregate demand, provide funds, and more. First, let's take a look at the tax credit. In the context of pandemic, companies are finding it difficult to expand, and some even facing bankruptcy. Taxes will be an additional burden for businesses in such a difficult environment, forcing many to abandon the industry. According to IISA, enterprises may need 3 years to resume normal operations following an economic slump induced by the lockdown restriction. During the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic downturn, tax credit policy may have decreased the operating burden on businesses while also boosting the vitality of market entities, relieving the downward trend on the economy and supporting high-quality development. Thus, to help businesses suffer through difficulties in the pandemic, numerous countries, including China, adopted tax credits policy to assist enterprises, mitigating the negative impact. Based on the simulations result, the 2018 and 2019 tax rate reductions stimulated the vitality of market entities and expanded total demand, thereby stimulating economic growth. The actual GDP rose by 0.21%, and residents' income, residents' consumptions, total investment, total export amount, and the output value of various industries increased substantially. Other countries also adopted a similar policy to help boost the economy through the crisis. And that is the end of my presentation. Now we will move to the next part with Bruhh.
Hence, now we come to three types of tax credit. First and foremost, in terms of child tax credit (CTC), the citizens can reduce the amount they have to pay on the federal taxes based on parents' income and the number of legal children within the family, according to the U.S. Treasury Department and Internal Revenue Service. This temporary help for the federal institutions has helped millions of American households so that the parents can reduce the financial burdens, participate in the labor force, and focus on the work. Secondly, Earned Income Tax Credit (EITC), also an effective tool to tackle the unemployment and poverty, especially during the COVID-19 period, by stimulating the low-wage citizens' purchases of goods and services with their disposable income, which eventually benefits the economy. Thirdly, there was Employee Retention Credit, which belonged to the CARES Act of the USA, focused on the corporations which have been detrimentally affected by the pandemic. This tax incentive covered wages of the employees up to $10,000, regardless of size of the business. Although the American views though unemployment policies tax incentive as less important compared to the early stage of the pandemic. However, the unemployment rate would peak at 48% in April, has fallen to 6.7% in November, while the extended employment benefit expired in July 2020. Furthermore, the decline in support of this policy doesn't come from the unemployed and the one with poor health condition, who benefit the most from the policy and trigger for the economic growth the most. Now, Phương will give you information related to government spending.
Thank you, Ho, for your clarification. Now I will discuss how increased government spending can benefit. In a recession, expansionary fiscal policy can boost aggregate demand. Increase in government spending in work program and public employment can directly stimulate employment. When the government increases its spending, more social projects will be created. Protected at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was an act resulting from fiscal stimulus in which the government invested in infrastructure project, education, and medical. The Council of Economic Advisors estimated employment increased by more than 2.3 million. As a result of this, more jobs created mean an increase in wages, which will incentivize people to spend more so they have more income. As a result, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. During the pandemic, the increase in government spending to provide funds to state and locality have proved to be beneficial to society. Due to COVID-19, the state budgets have been reduced, and this affects spending on social programs and public services. A rise in the funds of state and locality can help to maintain the beneficial projects. The temporary assistance for needy families are these families with children that cannot provide for the family basic needs. Paycheck protection program provided loans to small businesses to retain workers and prevent a further decline in spending due to large wages. In short, increasing the government supply to state and locality can help to improve the condition of people in the pandemic. Next, he will discuss the challenges of fiscal policy.
Thanks a lot of useful information from Phương. Moreover, our team believes there are challenges in tax policy in developing countries. So there still is a concern with tax administration in developing countries, which might decrease the ability for enforcing a lot of tax base and cut losses in tax revenues. Firstly, our team believes developing countries are unable to deter tax evasions. According to Tanzi and Z, many developing countries are currently unable to deter tax evasion due to the weak anti-abuse provision in tax laws and insufficient technical training of tax auditors. Additionally, in OECD journal in 2021, balancing the requirement to offer the income assistance while also collecting taxes had also been exceedingly difficult for developing nations with little fiscal space and high debt burdens. Moreover, according to Tanzi and Howell in 2021, also state that statistics generated by the tax departments in many developing countries are untrustworthy data because of the informal nature of the economy and funding constraints. Policymakers are unable to analyze the possible impact of substantial tax changes due to the lack of data. As a result, even when big structural changes are plainly better, little modifications are frequently selected, and consequently, inefficient tax structures are still in use. Last but not least, political and societal issues complicate the development of tax system in developing countries. In donations, lack of political motivation to promote tax reform has frequently resulted in failed reform. The important ingredient, according to the lesson learned from successful reform projects, is strong political motivation, as indicated by the commitment from leaders at all levels of government. So that's the end of my presentation. Now we move to the next part presented by Hưng.
Thanks, Hing. So we all heard that fiscal policy can be used to stabilize the economy in theory, but there are substantial obstacles to the use of such policy. One problem is that fiscal policy do not affect the economy immediately, but instead work with a long lag called implementation lag, which stems largely from the difficulty of collecting economic data in timely and accurate fashion. It may take years before politicians acknowledge that there has been an economic shock. This delay occurred because economic process usually take place over time and data documenting the state of the economy, which eventually trouble policymakers to stabilize the economy. An example was the 2008 recession was not identified until October 2008, when the NBER announced that it had begun in December 2008. 2007. The implementation lag results partly from the nature of bureaucracy itself. Government spending requires bureaucratic approval of that spending. Consequently, to make any change in fiscal policy, a bill must go through congressional committee, pass both the House and the Senate, and be signed by the President. It can take years to propose, pass, and implement a major change in fiscal policy. Because of this long lag, policymakers who want to stabilize the economy need to look ahead of economic conditions that they are likely to prevail when the action will take effect. Forecasting accuracy, particularly over longer time horizon, is critical for fiscal policy legitimacy. Unfortunately, economic forecasting is notoriously inaccurate because the macroeconomic is such a primitive science, and because the shocks that generate economic fluctuation are inherently unexpected. And a research conducted by the IMF on a sample of 63 industrial and developing nations revealed that a private sector forecaster were only able to foresee 2 out of 60 recessions that occurred during the study period. So too often, policymakers trying to stabilize economy end up having a positive effect. Opposite effect. Economic condition can easily change between the time a policy action begins and the time it takes effect. As a result, the government can stabilize the intrinsically unstable economy if the implementation lag is sufficiently short. Economic policymakers should refrain from intervening often with a fiscal policy and be content if they do no harm. Next is another drawback: budget deficits and rising public debt, presented by Min.
Thanks, Hung. So now we will talk about rising budget deficit and debt burden. As you already know, to boost economic growth in crisis, the government needs to increase spending and reduce tax, which will eventually result in a budget deficit. In history, the US federal government spent $787 billion in deficit to boost economic growth after the Great Recession. Besides, rising budget deficit could possibly increase the interest rate and crowd out or discourage private sector investments. However, private sector investment is the key to our sustained economic growth and innovation in both developed and developing countries. The majority of products and services we are relying on today, such as smartphones, cars, or vaccines, would not exist in the absence of private investors who are willing to take risks. Also, increasing government spending equates to rising public debt burden. According to the US Treasury Data Lab, the majority of government spending used for economic recovery are financed by borrowing. However, all countries have already incurred an enormous debt burden. According to Statista, the US national debt in 2020 has surpassed 21 trillion, and Vietnam national debt in 2020 was approximately $159,000 million. Therefore, if the government increases the expenditure, crowding out effect and debt burden are inevitable. Accordingly, when implementing the expansionary fiscal policy, it seems important for the government to consider these consequences. Next, we will move on to the suggestion part with him.
Thanks to Min, our team suggests the central government to learn from the previous crisis to accurately foresee the future. It is incredibly complicated to handle upcoming economic turmoil in an unpredictable setting such as the present. By relying on past knowledge, the government increased decision accuracy. The government should be prepared regarding policy and money to deal with unexpected emergencies. Fiscal policy should be straightforward and rigid in terms of timing, budgets, and discipline to avoid accidentally economic instabilities. In general, to counter the recession, the government needs to improve the government spending and tax cuts to a certain level of fiscal size in order to produce a high fiscal multiplier. The government tends to tailor the size of fiscal measure to the estimate of the output gap size, which is the difference between expected output and the output if the economy is functioning at full capacity. Therefore, the fiscal stimulus side and fiscal multiplier matter in going up achieving a successful fiscal policies. In the COVID-19 recession, the government needs to implement an expansionary fiscal policies. The massive economic downturn had affected the living conditions of both business and citizens. Therefore, to help improve the employment rate and stimulate the economies, the government should provide aid and support the affected. It is a commission recommendation that all countries need to continue supporting their economy to recover from the several shock and sustain the economy using all necessary measures, stated by Harold Tunisian. Accordingly, when the economic downturn dissipates, countries should pursue expansionary fiscal policy aimed at achieving prudent medium-term fiscal position and ensuring debt sustainability while enhancing investment rate to reduce the crowding effect. Now we move to the conclusion with Min.
So thanks, Saint, for an incredible suggestion. To craft everything up in a theoretical view, the increase in government spending and tax credit can stimulate aggregate demand. Implementing tax credit have shown their effectiveness during the COVID-19 in terms of tax tackling rises by reducing the operating burdens, increasing investment, and improving production efficiency. Also, all three types of tax credit have shown their positive significant influence in supporting vulnerable individuals and organizations regarding employment, wage, and living standard. Besides, the increased government spending also yield positive outcomes on employment rate and economic efficiencies through the increase of aggregate demand. Moreover, government spending can also act as additional financial resources to the state and local capital for their social program and services. However, there are some challenges in the implementation of fiscal policy. Firstly, fiscal policy takes time to affect the aggregate demand. This tendency could lead to difficulties in the effort of stabilizing the economy due to changes of the economy during lag period and unpredictability of the economy. Secondly, the economists can inadvertently exacerbate the economy. In developing countries, the policymakers have to find a method not to only minimize the budget deficit while offering financial assistance, but also deter tax evasion due to their weak tax audit system. Last but not least, the expansionary policy could result in a rising budget deficit, which can trigger the crowding out effect and decrease the stimuli effect of our expansionary fiscal policy. And that is our presentation. Thank you very much for your listening.